In a quiet apartment building in Milwaukee, an ordinary door once hid one of the darkest crimes in American history. Neighbors noticed a smell, police came and went, and life seemed to continue. But behind that door, something unimaginable was happening, and the warning signs were already there. Tonight, we look back at the Jeffrey Dahmer case, not to sensationalize horror, but to understand how a series of human failures allowed it to continue for so long. Jeffrey Dahmer did not live in a remote cabin or an isolated house. He lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by other families, workers, and neighbors. The Oxford apartments were not hidden from the world. They were part of a living city, and yet for years Dahmer killed inside that space, unnoticed or ignored, until it was too late for many. Dahmer's crimes began long before Milwaukee. His first known killing happened in 1978 in Ohio. For years afterward, his behavior escalated. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, he was bringing victims back to his apartment, primarily young men, many of them vulnerable, some of them teenagers, some of them from minority communities. What happened inside that apartment would later shock even experienced investigators. On July 22, 1991, the story finally broke open. A man named Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment and ran into the street, disoriented and injured. He led police back to apartment 213. When officers entered, they found evidence that immediately told them this was not an ordinary crime. Photographs, human remains, and signs of repeated killings were discovered. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together a horrifying timeline. Dahmer confessed to murdering 17 males between 1978 and 1991. The scale of the violence and the calm manner in which he described it stunned the nation. But as the details emerged, another story began to take shape, one that still fuels anger and debate today. Just 2 months before Dahmer's arrest, on May 27, 1991, police officers encountered a 14-year-old boy, Konorak Synthasamphone. The child was naked, disoriented, and bleeding. Neighbors, including a black woman who lived nearby, pleaded with officers, telling them the boy was in danger and that something was deeply wrong. Dahmer told police the boy was his boyfriend and that this was a private dispute. Despite the obvious red flags, despite the age difference, despite the condition of the child, officers accepted Dahmer's explanation. They returned Konorak to Dahmer's apartment. The boy was killed shortly afterward. This moment has become one of the most painful and controversial chapters in the case. Many ask a simple question: how could this have happened? How could police walk a wounded child back into the home of the man who would kill him? The officers involved were later disciplined, but those penalties were overturned on appeal. They were reinstated with back pay. Years later, one of them rose to a leadership position within the police union. For many people, especially in marginalized communities, this outcome felt like a second betrayal. As the trial approached, public attention focused intensely on Dahmer himself. His defense argued insanity, pointing to his mental state and compulsions. Prosecutors argued that despite his disorders, Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing and that it was wrong. In February 1992, a jury found him legally sane. He was convicted of 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin and sentenced to multiple life terms. Later, he was convicted in Ohio for his first killing, receiving an additional life sentence. Justice, in the legal sense, had been delivered. But closure was far more complicated. Many neighbors later spoke about the smell coming from Dahmer's apartment. Complaints had been made, explanations were given, plumbing problems, spoiled food, fish tanks. In hindsight, these explanations feel impossible to accept. Yet at the time, they were accepted by landlords, maintenance workers, and authorities. The question remains whether these failures were simple negligence or something deeper. A recurring theme in public discussion is bias. Dahmer was a white man. Many of his victims were young men of color. Some were immigrants. Some were teenagers. Critics argue that warnings were ignored because the victims were seen as less important, less credible, or less worthy of protection. Others argue that the failures were the result of incompetence and poor training rather than deliberate prejudice. What is clear is that basic procedures, like checking identification or separating individuals for questioning, were not followed. The physical setting of the crimes adds another disturbing layer. Dahmer did not live in darkness. His apartment was reportedly bright, ordinary, even tidy in some ways. He kept plants alive. He cared for fish. This contrast unsettles many people. It challenges the idea that monsters always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors. After Dahmer's arrest, the Oxford apartments became a symbol of collective trauma. Eventually, the building was demolished. Today, the site is an empty lot. For some, this was an attempt to erase the memory. For others, it was a necessary step toward healing. The city of Milwaukee has struggled with how to remember the case, balancing the need to honor victims without turning a place of suffering into a spectacle. In prison, Dahmer became a quiet figure. He gave interviews, some of which sparked controversy over whether they granted him too much attention. In 1994, he was killed by another inmate while serving his sentence. His death closed the legal chapter of the case, but it did not end the questions surrounding it. The Dahmer case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about society. It shows how systems designed to protect can fail, especially when victims are young, poor, or marginalized. It shows how authority can side with those who appear respectable, even when evidence suggests otherwise. And it shows how violence can hide in plain sight. It also raises ethical questions about how we tell these stories. There is a fine line between informing the public and turning tragedy into entertainment. Many families of victims have spoken about the pain of seeing the case repeatedly revisited, often focusing more on the killer than on the lives that were lost. Remembering the victims means remembering them as people, not just as names in a case file. Today, decades later, the emotions remain raw. For some, the case represents the ultimate failure of policing. For others, it is a warning about complacency. For many, it is a reminder that listening, truly listening, can be a matter of life and death. As we reflect on this story, the most important questions may not be about Jeffrey Dahmer himself, but about us. How do we treat those who come forward with warnings? Whose voices do we trust? And what systems do we need to change to make sure that no one is ever handed back into danger again? What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can uncover more stories together. This content is compiled and analyzed based on publicly available information and open discussions.